Soil Biotics Organic Growth Boost is a liquid humic acid product that promotes the conversion of nutrient elements such as N, P, and K into forms more available to plants, thereby improving uptake of nutrients, micronutrients, and water by plants. It also improves the biological structure of the soil by helping to neutralize both acid and alkaline soils. Efficient is Soil Biotics fish emulsion-based liquid organic fertilizer additive. This product is a rich source of nutrients that slowly break down and release nitrogen into the soil. It is an excellent food source for soil microbes and helps relieve plant stress in the event of drought, heat, and excessive water conditions. Soil Biotics SB 4400 is a liquid product containing a combination of living, beneficial microorganisms that allows plants to take in nitrogen from the atmosphere, enhances natural growth promoting functions in the plant, and can increase organic matter and CEC in the soil. Soil Biotics organic products are formulated to work together to provide a continuous beneficial growth environment to meet all of your organic agricultural needs. For product details, visit soilbiotics.com or call 815-929-1752. The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds.
You're listening to Rooted in Organic Podcast. I'm Mike Klein, and along with Brian Wood, we are sitting down with Monty Schrunk today. He is with Suburban Sodbusters, and he is a natural beekeeper in, is it St. Louis?
In St. Louis, Missouri, correct.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, and can you give us a little bit of a background?
Absolutely. And to be honest, the background of me getting into beekeeping probably kind of meshes in real well with your focus on organic gardening, because that's really where I started. I've had a garden in my backyard for a while. It's kept growing year to year. And one year I noticed that I didn't feel like I was getting enough pollination in the garden. Kind of a common problem. You know, if your stuff's not growing, it's not getting pollinated, right? It's not my fault. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just put a couple beehives back here and in the backyard and improve that pollination. That's really where it started. I didn't have any prior interest in beekeeping or anything of that sort. But then once I started researching honeybees, it really kind of took off. I really found out how fascinating the world of honeybees is, and just the interest grew. And getting into it, my research led me in the conventional directions, learning how 90% of beekeepers in the U.S. keep bees using the Langstroth hives and all the practices that beekeepers do. But then I discovered, and I believe it was through Doug and Stacy's YouTube channel, saw Dr. Leo Shurashkin talking about the Layens hives that he uses. And he promoted the book that was written by Fedor Lazutin and edited by Leo Shurashkin, Keeping Bees with a Smile. And so I read the book, and as a gardener who tries to follow organic methods, working with the nature of the soil, with beneficial plants, beneficial insects, and all that sort of thing, the book Keeping Bees with a Smile talks about working with the nature of the bees. So it just fell hand in hand with the way I tried to do my gardening. It just all made sense to me. And so I read that book, and it piqued my interest. I ended up going to a seminar a Dr. Leo Shrashkin's seminar in southern Missouri, and which was more information about really the nature of the bees and how the bees live, and learning to work with that nature. And so things really took off from there. I adopted that approach. It made sense to me on the one hand. On the other hand, it seemed too insanely simple to work. But over the past few years of following those methods, they have worked fantastically for me. And things have grown to where here we are today at homesteading, the Homestead Festival, and try to teach other people about these methods.
Before you go into the methods, let's go back to, you said you were gardening and just decided to get some bees. That's not that's not something that, you made it sound very simple and just kind of went right by it. But I know that wouldn't be in my repertoire. So what kind of drew you to, or what did you do in that initial stage of, figuring out what needed to be done, or was it just dive right in and figure it out as you went?
Well, I am typically a planner. Maybe I'm a little unusual in some ways. If I, I'm the type of person who, if I buy, something, I'm going to read the manual. I want to know how to do things, how things work before I get into it. So I was kind of doing a year of research before I got into beekeeping. Mm-hmm. Now I had bought, the Langstroth hives are used by the majority of beekeepers in the U.S. I found somebody selling some used Langstroth, which are the stacking boxes that people are probably familiar with seeing. So I bought some of that equipment. I started buying some things to get ready, but I didn't have any bees at that point. So, I know some people will just jump in with both feet and figure we'll learn as we go along. That's not really my approach. I was spending some time doing some research. So before I ever actually got bees, I had already kind of set my path to follow the more natural beekeeping approach.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And can you explain the difference between, you call it the Langstroth?
Yes, Langstroth.
What do you call them? The
layens?
Or the layens?
Yeah. So the Langstroth, it's a vertical hive system, and it originated from Reverend L.L. Langstroth back in the mid-1800s. And Reverend Langstroth, and I don't want to besmirch his name, he gave us a lot of things that were revolutionary for beekeeping. Not necessarily things that he discovered, but things that he standardized. So prior to Langstroth, there were some hives that used removable or moving frames. So if you've seen a beehive, you have seen beekeepers pull out the different frames that have the comb on them. Prior to that, a lot of beekeepers used either skeps, which are kind of like an upside-down wicker basket that the bees build comb inside of that basket, which is not removable comb. Or prior to that, the old way was, skeps have been around a long time, so have what's called gums, which is basically just a hollow log that people would use to keep the bees in. Somebody told me that they're called gums because they would typically use hollow logs from a gum tree. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a plausible explanation for the name. But so either of those, you couldn't really remove the comb to inspect the colony. To know that a colony was doing well, you just kind of had to trust, they're going in and out, they look fairly healthy. And I shouldn't say too much about that because I don't have any experience using those. But Reverend Langstroth, he kind of standardized the removable frames. He also standardized the concept of bee space. So when we make a hive to put the bees in, you want to leave enough space around the frame so that the bees are not going to connect those spaces with comb, not going to fill those spaces with comb, and they're not going to bind things together with propolis, which is a product the bees make using tree rosin. And so if you leave about a 3/8 inch space between the, like the frame ends and the walls and things like that, that's about the right space that the bees will not fill with comb or connect with propolis. So he gave us that concept, which helped a lot in working with the hives. We have the frames we can remove, and we can remove the frames because the bees aren't tying everything together. So that was a lot of benefits. But the hives also he uses stacking boxes. And like I mentioned earlier, people have probably, if they've seen beehives, you've probably seen the Langstroth hives, at least in the U.S.
That's what I have.
Okay, and so you start with a deep box on the bottom, a 9.5-inch box on the bottom. Let the bees fill that. You put another 9.5-inch bottom on that, and that's the space the bees will typically use for their brood. And then typically you'd put a super on top of that, and a super is just a box that goes on top of the others. And those supers are usually either medium, 6 inches deep, or shallows, which are 4.5 inches deep. And that's where the bees put the honey. And then there's all sorts of components to put these together. You have a bottom board, which is where the bees come in, and some people use a solid bottom board or a ventilated bottom board, and then on top you have an inner cover and a lid on top of that, and you might use a queen excluder in between boxes so the queen stays in the bottom and doesn't come to the top, and all these different pieces that you have to work together. It kind of works towards the beekeeper, again going back to those concepts of being able to remove the comb to inspect the hives. But some downsides of that are that in order to inspect the hives, you have to tear the hive apart. You pull the lid off, and now you've exposed the entire, all the bees in the top box. The frames don't touch along the length of the frame, so once you open it up, it's all, that box is all open to the air. To inspect the lower boxes, you have to pull off the top boxes, which again is going to disrupt the hive and also requires the beekeeper to be lifting those heavy boxes and moving them around, which is part of what led me to look at horizontal hives, which I'll talk about with the Layens hives. But so that's the Langstroth in a nutshell. And as I mentioned, as I was looking at this and lifting boxes, I kind of discovered, horizontal hives. One of the first places I looked at was what's called a long Langstroth, where it's the deep, so the 9-inch Langstroth frames, and but they're in a horizontal configuration. So you have a long box where you put those frames, and so you don't use the supers on top. The bees will typically put their brood, or the area where they raise their young bees, closest to the entrance, and then honey farther away from that. So it simplifies management in that you have the removable frames, you're not having to lift heavy boxes, and you can just work along the hive. And so it's a big benefit, especially for people who might have any sort of physical issues that make it hard for them to lift boxes, or just don't want to have to lift boxes. The downside of the long Langstroth is that it's still 9-inch frames, which, especially in some areas of the country, may not support good overwintering of the bees. You want to give the bees enough space for the colony to have resources to survive over winter. And I mentioned earlier I went to Dr. Leo Sharashkin's seminar. He uses primarily the Layens hives. And he uses Layens horizontal hives because that's what he grew up with. He grew up in Russia, saw his uncle who was a beekeeper. I believe reading Keeping Bees with a Smile, Fedor Lazutin is also Russian. And he talks a lot about the beekeeping industry in Russia and how the communists kind of pushed all the beekeepers to what he refers to as industrial beekeeping, using basically vertical hives. I don't know if Langstroth is the standard or something similar, but Dr. Leo's family, I believe, were still using the Layens horizontal hives. That's what he grew up with and learned how to use. So he promotes that system, and as a horizontal, the Layens hives that I use provide some benefits for both the beekeeper and the bees. It's a horizontal hive, so the bees are building in a horizontal configuration, like I mentioned, with the brood close to the entrance and the honey farther away. But they use deeper frames. So the frames on the Langstroth are about 16 inches deep, as opposed to the 9 inches of the, I'm sorry, I said Langstroth area. The frames on the Layens are 16 inches deep, as opposed to the 9-inch deep frames on the Langstroth. And that provides a greater space for bees to store honey resources at the top of the frames to survive over winter. When the bees overwinter, they're going to kind of, when the colony gets cold, they'll kind of form a cluster to consolidate their heat. That cluster won't move across frames, but it'll move vertically on the frames that they're on and consume the honey that they've stored up. So those lay-ins frames provide a natural platform for the bees to provide for themselves over winter enough resources that they don't need to be fed over winter. As I mentioned, they're removable frames, so the beekeeper can pull them out and inspect them. The frames that I use in the lay-ins hive do touch along the top. I mentioned that the Langstroth frames don't touch, so the bees, when you open the top, the bees come out in between the frames. On the lay-ins hive, when you open the lid, you haven't actually opened where the bees are. You pulled the lid off, and now you see the top of the frames, but the frames are still touching, so there's still a ceiling over the bees. And you're not disrupting the entire colony. When you inspect the Langstroth hive, you pull the frames to the side. There's a divider board at the end. You manage the space to just what the bees need. Or you basically, as I say it, you let the bees tell you how much space they need, and you just add space. And you use a divider board. So if the bees need only 7 frames out of a 20-frame hive, you only give them a 7-frame space and expand as needed by moving the divider board over and adding more frames in. But so back to, you open the hive, you see those top frames. If I want to get in and inspect, I move the divider board, pull a couple frames aside, and I'm only exposing the bees in the space that I'm inspecting. So I'm never tearing apart the whole hive. I'm never disrupting the entire colony to do inspections. And my experience with it, I'll admit, that I have a little bias after working with the lay-ins, but I have worked with Langstroth to get the comparative experience. And my experience, it's a much gentler experience working with the lay-ins hives than the Langstroth. The bees tend to be more calm and less defensive when I go in to the lay-ins hives as opposed to the Langstroth. And it provides I said it's a benefits for the keeper and the bees. I believe the lay-ins provides a more natural environment for the bees, because when the bees move into any space, they're going to build their natural comb starting from the top and moving down. And they're going to build continuous comb down to the bottom of the space. As opposed to the segmented comb of the Langstroth, the stacking hives. And in the stacking hives, you're encouraging the bees to build from the bottom up, which is contrary to their nature. So it provides that the lay-ins hive provides that space where the bees can start at the top of the frame, build the comb all the way down, start building comb on the next frame, start building comb on the next frame as they work their way into the hive. So it's kind of provides that environment similar to what the bees would be doing in a natural space.
Mm-hmm. How does the extraction process work?
The extraction is very similar to what people with Langstroth hives do. I do use an extractor that spins the frames. The lay-ins frames are a different dimensions than yes, I think I said that right. The lay-ins frames are different dimensions than the Langstroth. So it does require a large frame extractor. The frames are 14 inches wide, 16 inches deep, so you can't fit them in Langstroth extractors that you can find all over the market. There are a few companies that do make large frame extractors for the lay-ins frames. Some people balk because the extractors for lay-ins frames are more expensive, but they're more expensive because it's a larger, the tub on the extractor where you spin the frames is larger, and it's actually the same tub that's used for 9-frame Langstroth extractors. So if you go out and you price a 9-frame radial Langstroth extractor, it's going to be comparable apples to apples to what the price is for a lay-ins extractor. So I mentioned that just because a lot of people, when you start to mention the lay-ins extractors, they're like, well, that's expensive, so it's an obstacle. It's really, when you compare apples to apples, it's a comparable price. But the process is the same. You take the frames, scrape off the wax cappings. The bees, as they store the honey in the frames, they'll cure the honey or dry it down to a low moisture content and then put wax cappings over it. You scrape the wax cappings off, put those frames into the extractor where you spin the frames and spin out the honey. Some like to go, I prefer to use frames in an extractor, which the frames I use have wire in the frame to support the comb, so the comb doesn't all blow apart when you put it in the extractor. Others prefer to go even a step more natural, and I guess you could say natural, that they don't like to use the wires in the frames. Instead, they will just cut the comb out and crush it to remove the honey, or just use the cut comb if somebody prefers that. So
Fresh homemade bread with cut comb on it is not, and butter is not bad.
I haven't tried that.
Oh, growing up, that was whenever Dad had some comb that he would take out.
Mm-hmm.
That was the treat. Mom would bake fresh bread with butter and honeycomb on
And
it.
honeycomb, okay. I'll add that to my list of things to try and encourage people.
Yes.
So you said, I'm just thinking back to the Shrashkin, or however you said, in Russia they were pushing to use the vertical hives, or in whatever form it was in, and that is the most common that we see in this country too. What moved people that direction? Why was that the mass?
I think it was seen as a productivity thing. There is a concept that the vertical hives using the supers are more productive when it comes to harvesting honey than the horizontal hives. I don't know that it's true. I've never seen a good study that emphasizes that one way or another. But I think that's what the perception was, and I think that's why the communist Russian government kind of pushed people toward. They're focusing more on productivity over everything else. That's my hypothesis as to why. I don't necessarily have the historical reasoning. But as far as that productivity, it's interesting because people will say, well, I don't like horizontal hives because they don't make as much honey. In his book, George DeLayens, who promoted the Layens hives like I used, he published his book in 1892. Dr. Leo Shrashkin publishes an edited, and I say an edited version, the text is basically the same. He adds in some footnotes because in 1892 there were some concepts of beekeeping that we understand better now. So he would add in footnotes to kind of add a little context and things. But otherwise it's a neat book because it's that 1892 historical context. But he says in his book, he has a whole section talking about vertical hives, and basically here's how you manage vertical hives. But he also says in there several times different things, saying to the point of, this is how you do it, but I don't like vertical hives. and he would say in there, one of the things is, I get more production from my horizontal hives than I do from vertical. So his perception of it was different from what the common perception is now. Like I said, I don't know that I've seen a study that argues one way or another about it. I do think one thing that could make a difference is that a common practice with vertical hives is let the bees store up honey in the supers and then take all that honey away and feed them sugar water to make up for it. In the way I keep, the hives, I always leave the bees enough honey. I take the surplus, but leave them enough honey for their survival. So that could be a difference right there, is that you're not taking all the available honey.
So how do you decide how much they will need?
My typical rule of thumb, and a lot of beekeeping is regional. So depending on a person's location, the farther north you are, or if you have a longer dearth period where there's not nectar coming in and so on, would vary these sorts of things. But my common rule of thumb, when I harvest honey I do 2 honey harvests during the year. I do one at the end of the nectar flow. So coming up probably this next week, I'll be doing a honey harvest. And then I do another one in fall. When I get the bees ready for winter, I will pull any excess honey. And as I describe this, I'll mention that this is part of what sold me on the Layens hives, is seeing how, I call it stupid easy it is to prepare them for winter. Because when I go in for the summer harvest, I know that we're going to have a dearth period through July and August that the bees are going to have to get through. So I will leave them working from the end of the hive farthest from the entrance back towards the hive. I will take full frames of honey, but I will leave the bees at least one full frame of honey, and then any other partial frames, maybe they've been storing nectar but not quite capped it yet or anything. Beyond that, any other additional full frames of honey I will take. And when I say a full frame, a large frame like the lay-ins frame, where it's, within the boundaries of the frame, it's 13 by 15 inches of comb. That's pretty big. And so sometimes you don't get the whole thing all nicely, capped, filled and capped. But as long as I have a frame that's about 75% capped honey, that tells me it's ready to harvest. You don't want to get honey that has too high of a moisture content, but I've never had a problem with a high moisture content as long as the honey is 75% capped or more. So when I so that's the summer harvest. When I get in that additional honey I leave, has not been a problem for the bees to get through their dearth period. When I come back for winter, we have a fall nectar flow, kind of a light nectar flow during the fall. But I go back in to prepare the hive for winter. When I prepare for winter, there's two things I'm wanting to do, is leave the bees enough resources to get through winter and into the next spring. And I said two things and I just blanked. Oh, and make sure that I'm not leaving the bees too much space for winter. I want to kind of condense the hive so the colony is fairly consolidated, so they can retain their heat over winter. So what I do, again, working from the far end of the hive, is I will work my way back towards the brood. Any full frames of honey I can pull out to harvest, except I leave one full frame on each end of where the brood area is. The brood frames are where the bees are going to overwinter. The brood frames themselves will or should have a band of honey across the top. That's the honey the bees are going to live on over winter. And the honey frames that I leave on each end, kind of like bookends, that's the honey that they'll use come spring when they start producing new brood. And anything beyond that, any full honey frames beyond that, I can harvest. If there's partial frames beyond that, partial honey frames, depending on the state of them, I might pull them out, put them in the freezer to use for resources next year for hives. Or if they're fairly empty, I might just slide them to the opposite end of the hive just for storage until the next year. But so basically all the bees need over winter is bookends of honey and then enough frames in between with honey at the top. And the bees prepare that. By using bees that are acclimated to my area, the bees adequately store up enough. They know how to be bees better than I do. And so they store up honey, to get through winter. And all I have to do is, leave the spaces I've described, and it all works well. Mm-hmm. I don't have to do. I've seen, beekeepers in lots of beekeeping groups doing. It seems to me like complex calculus, figuring out how much honey they have to leave for their colony, and how much sugar are they going to put on top, and everything. And I don't have to do any of that.
Just make sure it's enough.
Yeah. Just look in there, and I will be very honest. There have been past years where, as I'm going through the hives, maybe I ran out of time during the day, or got tired. I don't want to say I was lazy. Maybe I was, but there's been some times as I was inspecting the hives to make sure they were ready for winter that I didn't look at every frame to make sure they had that band of honey at the top. I just kind of, I got to the end of the full honey frames. I said, okay, here's a honey frame for them, and then just left them, trusted that they had prepared themselves for winter adequately. And, surprise, surprise, the bees knew what they were doing, and they survived winter just fine without me having to go in and look and check up on them.
Do you have to put a queen excluder in?
You do not have to. Okay. in the horizontal hives. You can. And because it's a horizontal hive, if you do use a queen excluder, you would have to cut the excluder to fit vertically in between the frames, because it's obviously a different dimension you're dealing with and a different orientation. But you can do that, and some people will. I have not. Basically, the bees kind of manage their space usually in a fairly consistent fashion, where the brood is close to the entrance and the honey is farther away. Usually there's on the lay-ins frames, there's usually about 6 or 7 frames of brood, and beyond that is where they store their honey. The first couple frames past the brood, they usually store, some bee bread, the pollen and nectar mixed together. But then after that, they'll store full frames of honey.
Can you explain what a queen excluder
That's
is?
where I
Oh,
was
sure,
gonna
sure.
go.
Yeah, the queen excluder is just they can be made of metal or plastic, and it's basically just a sheet of material that has openings big enough for the worker bees to pass through, but too small for the queen to get through. The queen being bigger than the workers, she's not going to be able to fit through the spaces in the excluder. So that keeps the queen within the brood area, so you don't have the queen laying eggs and raising brood in the frames that you plan to harvest for honey. And I will mention that I've had some hives that, I could have taught a class using the hives on how a hive should be laid out, because they were perfect. Had packed brood frames, 6 or 7 frames by the entrance, a couple frames that were honey and pollen, and then all honey after that. It was just textbook. I have had some where, queens would lay eggs throughout, 10 or 11 frames. So I didn't get much honey from those hives. I could have put an excluder in those, but, I'm okay with a lower harvest, and I just kind of let the bees do what they want. I will often, when I have a hive like that, if I find the queen farther away from the entrance, I'll move her. I'll catch her and move her back by the entrance. And then I'll find a full honey frame and put that in about the 7th or 8th position in the hive. And the queen will typically not cross over a full honey frame. She'll usually stay, and when she gets to a frame that's all honey, she'll usually turn around and stay on the brood side. Not always, but sometimes they're obstinate. But I prefer to let them, if that's the way they're naturally going to raise their hive, I'll let them. Even if I don't get honey from that hive, it still can provide some good resource frames. If I have another hive that needs a little help or something, I can, go to this one to get some things. So.
And you talked about acclimating your bees to your area.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that?
Well, and this is kind of the starting point for, I call myself a natural beekeeper. I will, as I say that, I know there are some people who, even though they may have similar philosophies to beekeeping as I do, they kind of bristle at the term natural beekeeping, saying that, well, if you're putting bees in a box, a man-made box, it's no longer natural. And if you're keeping the bees, then they're not natural. They're either living naturally or they're being kept, one or the other. My definition of that term is that I work with the nature of the bees. Mm-hmm. So I just want to say that, because I know some people listening to this might say, well, that's not really natural if you're keeping, but that's my definition of the term. I could call it sustainable beekeeping. I could, use different terms, but terms like that require some explanation. Mm-hmm. So I think natural is more clear. And the beginning of that is using bees, as I mentioned, that are acclimated to your local area. Now, what that often means is that having bees with a genetic mix that works well within your area. So like, Italian bees are very popular, especially with commercial beekeepers, but that kind of carries over to a lot of backyard or hobbyist beekeepers. Because Italian bees produce a lot of brood. They can make a big, strong colony. And Italian bees work really well in southern climates where you have a lot of nectar flow, long, sustained nectar flows that can, support that growth. But if you take bees that are well suited for a southern Florida or Georgia climate, which is where, a lot of packages come from when people buy honeybee packages, and take those to, say, Michigan. And I pull that out because I just talked to a couple yesterday that had come from Michigan. They were here from Michigan, and they said, we've had problems the last few years because every year we buy packages and they do well for a while and then they get weak, and we've never had them survive over winter. I said, well, I could start an alligator farm in Minnesota, but it wouldn't work well for me or the alligators. So, I try not to be too flippant when I'm talking to people, but that was the best analogy I could come up with. Instead, I promote that people will catch bees from around their local area. It's not necessarily choosing the bees that you want to work with. It's but it's getting the bees that work well in your environment.
Letting them choose
Yeah.
you.
And so you ask about how do you acclimate the bees. I don't know, and there's a lot of hypothesis behind this. So understand that I'm not, take this with a grain of salt, because this is my own personal hypothesis, is that it's not so much about having a certain set of bees that learn over time how to work in sync with your climate and your nectar flow, but it's having bees that genetically have a predisposition that fits with your environment.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is, you might take Italian bees from Florida and raise that colony here, and maybe you can keep that colony alive. Or I say here, I mean wherever somebody who's listening is located, and maybe you can keep that colony alive for 3 years. I don't know that colony would ever really adapt and learn about your climate.
Sure.
They may always require some supplemental feeding to get by and so on. But if you were to split that colony and allow your splits that you make, and a split is just taking a colony, dividing it. A lot of times when people make a split, they might add a queen, but you can also let the bees raise a new queen if the conditions are right. If they have eggs where they can start from scratch and make a new queen, they can do that. And if they raise that new queen, and if your new queen is open mated in your area, she's going to go out and she's going to mate with drones from around your area. Drones being the male bees. That's their job, is to mate with other queens. And when they do that, you're going to have half of the genetics from your queen, wherever she came from, but half of the genetics now are going to be from the drones from your local area. If those drones, especially if they're from some feral colonies, and by feral I just mean colonies that have been living on their own for a while, whether that's in a tree or in somebody's barn wall, those drones are likely going to be kind of a mutt mix of genetics that have kind of established themselves as working well in that area. So now you're going to have 50% of those genetics. So that new colony may work a little better with your climate and your nectar flow. Now, if you split again, now you've got 25% that original queen's genetics. Mm-hmm. And if those new queens mate with local drones, now you're at about 75% local genetics. So I think what often works best for a given area is to be able to find or catch the bees that have lived in that area without being managed and maintained. You're not going to know what those genetics are. Are they Russian bees? Are they Italian bees? And the mix is probably going to be different in different parts of the country, just because different. And when I talk about the genetics, I'm talking about different strains of Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, originate from different parts of Europe, and so they're going to have characteristics that make them more suitable for different climates. And I think in every given area, those genetics that have worked well are going to intermingle and come up with a mutt variety that works well in that area. Mm-hmm. So that's when I talk about acclimated bees, that's really what I'm talking about. It's just those bees that have kind of established themselves as living well in that area, whatever those genetics are, rather than bees that have learned. And again, that's my own hypothesis, that it's based more on the genetics than any sort of learning.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Learn through experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Does the temperament change from hive to hive and swarm to swarm?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, every hive has its own
Like, why are some
personality.
you can't walk by without getting stung, and others you can be around them and sit there and nothing? Like, what is that, genetics, or did somebody mess with them?
And that's a good question. I think regardless of genetics, a lot of it has to do with the handling of the bees. And I'll come back to that in a second. I will say, and I'll throw out a disclaimer, I'm sure you probably have listeners that are along the, southwestern border of the U.S., Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, places where they have to deal with Africanized bees. I'm fortunate that, I'm from Missouri. I don't have to deal with Africanized bees, because Africanized bees have that, that's the killer bees that, as the media will term them. And they do have a genetic predisposition to be more aggressive. I don't often call honeybees aggressive. If bees, hives typically respond defensively to protect the hive, but Africanized bees, once once they go after a target, they're going to keep going after that target. But that, I don't have to deal with those. So I mentioned that as a call out to any listeners in that area. I feel for them having to deal with those. I don't have experience with those.
Do those not come further north?
It's my understanding that those particular genetics don't deal well with cold winters.
Okay.
Now, I also understand that they've done some genetic testing of bees from all over, going up, New England and so on, and they found, there's traces of those Africanized genetics all over. Bees across the U.S. have intermingled and everything, so you find all sorts of those traits, but it's watered down to where you don't necessarily see those behaviors. But that may come back. I don't have a definitive answer to your original question of why some colonies, some of it can be genetics. Like I mentioned, Africanized are known to be hot. Russian bees, which were brought into the country as a response to the threat of varroa mites, because Russians were thought to have more resistance to the varroa mites. But Russian bees are also kind of have a reputation for being a little more temperamental, maybe a little harder to work with for some. So those genetics can make a difference, but sometimes it's just, I don't know. I have, in my own apiary, I try to keep track of the different strains. So if I catch a colony, do a trap out from a tree, and I get a colony from that, I try to keep track of the propagations I've done, down the line. Which colonies do I have that came from that original trap out colony? Because I want to keep track of which of mine are the strongest and healthiest and kind of propagate those lines. And not the weaker ones. So I try to keep track of that. And I'll have some that I'll go 2 or a couple generations. These bees are great to work with. And then I'll make one split, and I'll have one colony that came from this original genetic line that they get aggravated every time I open the hive. And what's the difference? There might be some different genetics that came in from a drone that was mated. It might be just like humans. We have occasionally have a trait that's a throwback to our great-grandparents, or something. So it may be some of those residual genetics from a more aggressive, that are now showing up in this colony. I don't know. I do think handling makes a difference to it. I have learned a lot from Les Crowder, who has been keeping bees as long as I've been alive. So he has, a wealth of experience in beekeeping. And I would just spend hours sitting at Les's feet, listening to him, talk about his experience and learning from him. But he is known for his methodologies of working with bees. He started working bees when he was a kid. I shouldn't tell us. It's not my story to tell. I may get some things wrong, but he basically got bees, put them in a box, and just kind of learned himself how to keep bees. He didn't have any protective equipment or anything, no veil to wear or any of that, no smoker or anything. So what he learned in working with the bees is that if he worked real slowly and gently, he could work with the bees and they wouldn't bother him, And so he's still, watching him work with hive, he's real slow and gentle and methodical as he works the hives. And the bees kind of respond in kind. If the bees hardly know you're there, they don't get stirred up. They're not defensive. And so I kind of try to emulate his approaches as I'm working my own hives. And sometimes I have to catch myself to slow down, take deep breaths, almost make it, I don't want to put this too much out there, but almost make it a meditative experience as you're working with the hive, a slow, methodical, and the bees tend to respond in kind. And unless he'll have people that will call him and say, I have this hive that I can't work, they're too defensive, they're always after me. And he'll say, okay, I'll come help you with them. And he'll work the bees, and they just, they're just as calm and peaceful as could be in response to his methods. If you watch,
that's what my dad always said. No sudden movements. Mm-hmm. He said, if you get stung, don't react. Mm-hmm. He said, and I can watch Dad. But it was funny because the one hive, no protective gear whatsoever, hardly used a smoker. The next one, Dad's in a hazmat suit, and the hives are 4 feet apart.
Right.
And he said the one, and his movement is all the same, just the temperament in that one hive. And they actually, I think it was 2 weeks ago, they swarmed.
Okay.
And they swarmed to the top of the tree, and he couldn't get to them. And Well, there they go.
Yes, sometimes you say good riddance to a colony. I did a cutout. I mentioned I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier here or not. But anyway, I did a cutout from an apartment building earlier this spring. And as I was doing this cutout, people were walking by. This is on a balcony of the building. And people were walking by, saying they were so glad I was there because everybody around is getting stung by those bees. Now, my first reaction is I typically don't, in my apiary, I have very few colonies that I would even call defensive. I've been blessed with very gentle bees, even though I just get them from random, feral sources. But so my first reaction when I hear people say that, those bees have been stinging everybody, is it really those honeybees, or are people getting stung by yellow jackets or wasps and just blaming it on the bees? In some people's perception, anything that flies and has a stinger is a bee. But so I took these bees out and got them into a box and took them home. I didn't get the queen from that cutout. It was like a 5x3 space with all sorts of cross bracing and different places for bees to hide, and I obviously didn't get the queen out of there. It's possible I accidentally killed her in the process, but that's a whole other side thing. But I got the bees home, didn't have a queen, and I will tell you, I'm kind of glad I didn't get that queen, because when I would go and try to work with that hive and figure out what I was going to do about them, I started to believe the people at the apartment building.
Oh, really?
They were, pretty nasty bees, and I don't know why. So I that was one case where I had no regrets for not having that queen, because I didn't mind not having those same defensive genetics, around.
So, do you get calls? You're a bee removal guy?
I do removals.
So how do you? Because a swarm is a different breed than bee removal from a wall.
Right.
How do you go about getting bees into a box that aren't swarming?
The best thing is to find the queen. You find the queen, you're golden. Then the rest of the bees will kind of gladly go into the box with her. But in this case, it was such a convoluted environment trying to work in, and I'll say it was a mess. I did this in late February, and I told the department manager. He talked to me last fall, and I said, well, let's do this in early spring, because by that time the bees will have gone through winter and used up a lot of their resources, so there won't be as much honey in there to worry about. I pulled out 3 5-gallon buckets full of honeycomb out of this space. And I was working over my head to get that, so I ended up, at the end of the day, I was completely soaked head to toe, down to, every layer of clothing I had on, soaked with honey. It was a messy thing, but I would, as cleanly as I could, I would try to get out the comb that had the bees and the brood on it. I would take those sections, and this was a real fortuitous thing, because the one section where they had a lot of their brood happened to be sized almost exactly like the lay-ins frames that I used. So I took that comb, was able to rubber band it inside of the lay-ins frames without cutting it all apart or anything. So it was a beautiful thing. So I would, find their brood, put that brood in the frames, put that into a, what I call a swarm trap or a bait hive box. It's just a small 7-frame box. And, put those in there. As I'd pull out comb with bees, I'd shake the bees into the box, and the hope being, and I also have a bee vacuum. So I can go in. It's, without getting too much detail in describing it, it's a box with 2 chambers, uses a small shop vac head, and but I use a large hose on it, so it has a lower suction pressure. So you're not trying to just suck up the bees, but you're trying to do it in a way that is gentle to the bees. And so I'd take that, and I'd get into a place where there's a lot of bees, and I would take the bee vac and suck the bees up. They go into one compartment on the bee vac. And then when I get them home, I put the frames from the swarm trap into the hive, shake the bees from the bee vac into the hive. And at that point, because I never actually saw the queen, if I had seen the queen, I'd catch her in a queen clip, which looks like a little hair clip, but it's got gaps on it. So you put the queen inside, just like the queen excluder we described earlier. The queen can't get out, but the bees can get in, so they can go in and feed her and take care of her. If you can catch her in the queen clip and put her in the box, then that's great. The bees will gladly stay there. But I wasn't that fortunate to find her, didn't catch her in the bee vac, but like I said, that may have been kind of a blessing.
And you're trying to remove every single bee out of there.
Right. Trying to get it, yeah. Yeah, and there was, like I said, there were some gaps where bees were able to like run back behind, wood and so on. The one risk is if you leave much in there, well, there's a couple things. If you leave many bees in there, and especially if you leave the queen in there with a bunch of bees, they could just kind of start the colony new again. There may not be enough population for them to be successful at it, but they'll try. And you don't want that. You've just taken them out, and you don't want for the property owner's sake, you don't want those bees coming back. You also don't want other colonies moving in. But because a colony has already lived there, it's an attractive environment. So we try to cut out as much comb as possible, scrape off all the comb residue, get the space just as clean as possible. And then what I do is after I get all that cleaned out, I will take a product, and I'm not trying to promote a particular product, but I have a spray. It's Honey Bandit. And it's a spray that you use to get bees out of the honey supers when you're harvesting honey. It repels the bees, but it's a non-toxic product. And so I'll spray that inside of the space. And so hopefully any other swarms, if they come by, hopefully the smell of the Honey Bandit is more of a repellent than the smell that bees have been there is an attractant. So.
And then you have like what do you call it, a swarm catching box or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So how does that work?
So every spring, as the colonies start to build up, when the bees start to fill up their space, they reach a point. Some of this is so interesting to me. I'd like to just, take an hour and describe every detail. I'll try not to do that. But the bees reach a point to where it's time for them to propagate and go and start another colony. And that's kind of triggered because they get so populous that the queen's pheromone scent, which is kind of what keeps that colony cohesive, working together, they don't detect that throughout the entire hive anymore. And so what they will do is they start to make new queen cells. We call them swarm cells. They put those cells typically at like the bottom of the comb. Not that the location is important to this conversation, but those are some of the details I find interesting, how they do it differently depending on why or when they're making a queen. But so they start to raise new queens, and usually before those new queens emerge from their cells, then the existing queen and about half of the bees will take off to find a new home. Before they take off, those bees that leave will fill them, so they have a special honey stomach, and they'll load themselves up with honey and fly off as a swarm with the queen. So in the spring, when this happens, beekeepers or people wanting to become beekeepers can put out swarm traps or bait hives. And I have bait hives that I sell. I've tried to build them based on the research of Dr. Tom Seeley, who has for decades been researching bees in the wild and studying what do swarms look for. And so I tried to size my swarm traps to that standard. 40 liters is about the ideal size for a swarm trap box. And for those who keep in Langstroth boxes, it just so happens that a deep Langstroth box is about 40 liters. So somebody could just use a deep Langstroth box as a swarm trap if they want to do that. So you put it out, and there's it's kind of a whole conversation about all the whys and wheres, deciding where to put your swarm trap. I have a whole YouTube video about that topic. But so you put this box out, and the hope is that when you have that swarm that's looking for a new home, then they will find your box and see it as a satisfactory place. And there's things we can do to make it more attractive. One of them is adding old comb. I think one of the most beneficial things is adding old comb. And that tells the bees, hey, bees have lived here before, so it must be a pretty good place. I'm obviously paraphrasing from what the bees have told me. But then, the rest of the frames are the way I set them up, they're mainly empty frames with a starter strip at the top so that the bees will have a guide so that they build along the comb, not along the frames, not across the frames. But it leaves enough open space that when the bees come in and check out the space, it seems like it has enough space in that cavity for them to move in. Then we also use products. Lemongrass oil is the traditional product, and it's used because it smells like the Nasonoff pheromone that bees use to signal other bees to come to the hive. Bees' one of their natural communication methods being scents are very important for that attractant. There are other products. Swarm Commander is one commercial product. I was going to say not trying to promote a certain product, except I do happen to sell Swarm Commander as well. I did a YouTube video recently where we compared Swarm Commander and lemongrass oil on 4 different bait hives. 2 each with lemongrass oil, 2 each with Swarm Commander. And we found that bees checked out all 4 of them. We saw what we call scouting activity, bees going in and out and kind of inspecting all 4 of the swarm traps. But when it came to moving in, we found that the colonies moved into the 2 swarm traps that had Swarm Commander. So there's something about the product that, given the choice, they went for that rather than just the straight lemongrass oil. But they both work. I've often used just lemongrass oil, and that's worked as well. But that's the whole concept behind catching the swarm, is basically just having a box out there for them to move into in the right place at the right time when the swarms are out there.
And where do you decide where to put it? Do I put it in the orchard? Do I put it back in the woods?
You can put it. One mistake a lot of people make is they say, well, I see a lot of bees. There's a lot of flowers over here. I see a lot of bees foraging on these flowers, so I'm going to put my swarm trap right by here. The thing is, the bees that are foraging are not the ones that are looking for a new home. So it's not like bees are foraging and then going to go back to their hive with nectar and say, hey, here's some nectar. Also, I found a great place for us to move to. That doesn't really happen. But the typical places, tree lines are great. One common rule of thumb, bees will often use natural lines for navigation, just like we do. So they might follow a fence line or a power line or a tree line, or so following some of those lines is a good way to go. What I often tell people is look for those lines. If you have like a tree line, look for a tree that stands out a little bit. And that might be a good tree to try. Because bees go down this line. I don't know what it is about that tree that stands out, but for some reason, something that's a little different there kind of seems to make the swarm traps a little more noticeable.
And once you have a swarm there, do you then take it back and take it out and put it into a regular hive?
Right. Yeah, so you catch the swarm in your bait hive. Some will move it immediately. If they see a swarm move in, then they move it immediately. I prefer to let the swarm be in there for a little bit, kind of get established. I've seen some cases in my own backyard where a swarm will move into a box, and then if you move the box right away, then the bee, it's almost like something's going on here we don't like, and they'll take off again. But if you let them stay in there for a while, get established, build some comb, and that's what I mentioned, that before they leave their old hive, they load up their honey stomachs. And the reason they do that is so that they use that honey that they've stored up when they get to the new home to make comb, to make wax to build out new comb. And so give them time to build out comb for the queen to start laying. And a good sign that the queen is laying eggs is that you see bees coming into the bait hive carrying pollen. And then they'll have big, chunks of pollen on their back legs. It's pretty easy to spot. And they need that pollen to feed the brood that they're going to be raising. And so, so they're stimulated to bring in that pollen. It's possible that bees are just finding a good pollen source. So it may have no connection to brood, but it's also typically a good sign that they're raising brood if they're motivated to bring in pollen.
So you're saying a couple of weeks in
It could be, a few days up to a couple of weeks.
Okay.
It doesn't take them a couple of weeks to get established, but like in the swarm traps that I sell that use 7 layings frames, they're not going to fill that entire space in 7 weeks. Typically, I say that somebody might say, well, I had this colony that just blew things up, overnight. There's always exceptions, but typically they can stay in there for a few weeks. Okay. I tell people, especially if you have to get up on a ladder to get that swarm trap down, don't wait any longer than you need to. Once you see them bringing in pollen, then you can go ahead and get that swarm trap down and go move them into the full hive. Because obviously the longer they're in there, the heavier that box is going to get wherever it's at.
Two things. You said the drones or the worker bees are not the ones looking for a new home. Which group is looking for a new home? And then second question too is I'm just thinking, if I'm interested in buying a swarm trap and I live on a 3/4 acre lot on the edge of woods, if I just put that out, am I going to get something? Like, how dense are colonies in an area, or what are you targeting as far as places?
So your first question, as far as the bees, I mentioned that the foragers that are out on the flowers collecting nectar or pollen are not the ones looking for a new home. It's that, you have the worker bees, and within the worker bees, they have multiple different jobs. And throughout the lifespan, now worker bee during the spring, during winter work, they live longer, just for survival purposes. But during the season when they're out gathering and so on, they only live about 45 days. During that 45 days, they go through a series of jobs. Their first 3 weeks are spent living inside of the hive, taking care of, helping raise young brood, helping clean up the hive, carrying out dead bees, a variety of jobs that they kind of cycle through while they're inside of the hive. Once they reach that 3-week mark, about their last 3 weeks of their life, they spend as foragers, going out gathering nectar and pollen. When that colony swarms, and this could happen either just before they leave the hive or just after, but once they've swarmed, there are some bees that are going to leave that swarm. We call them scout bees. So it's still worker bees, it's just a different job.
Okay.
So the scout bees are going out looking for a home. They're not going out, they're not gathering pollen, they're not gathering nectar, they're just looking for a space for the colony to survive. And then when they find a space that they think looks good, they'll come back and let the other bees know about it. And then a few more will go and check it out. And it's kind of this exponential thing that as more bees go and find it and think it looks suitable, then they come back and they tell more bees, and it's kind of like this growing thing. And it's so interesting if you have a swarm trap up. And I live in like the name of my channel, Suburban Sodbuster, suggests, I live right in the middle of a suburban area, have neighbors on both sides. Across this, I have a street in front of my house, neighbors along the front. I put a swarm trap up right in the middle of my front yard on a tree in the front yard facing our front door. It's about 20 feet from our front door. And we've caught swarms in there, and it's so fun because you can watch that swarm trap and you can just see things start to grow before a swarm moves in. I'll see one bee kind of checking it out. And then a little bit later, I'll see 2 or 3 bees checking it out. And then I'll see, about 7 bees checking it out. And then about 12, start to see more bees around it checking it out. And then all of a sudden, here comes the cloud, as the bees start to move in. So you just see it start to grow as more bees keep coming back. Dr. Tom Seeley published a book called Honeybee Democracy, which is, kind of the topic of how do bees make those decisions of where they're going to go. And he talks about just some fascinating things that the bees do as a colony to make those decisions. So, to your answer, it's the same bees. It's all worker bees that are doing that scouting, okay, as well as doing the foraging off of flowers, but it's just a different task that they're focused on.
Mm-hmm. So where do the drones come in?
The drones are just the male bees. Their entire purpose in life is to mate with queens from other colonies.
So they're different from the worker bee?
Yes.
So the drones are just males that do nothing but breed?
Exactly. Yeah. Which sounds like, it's not a bad gig. Except that once that swarm season is kind of over and the hive has no more use for the drones, then they kick the drones out.
You're done.
Yeah.
And they can't go get in with another hive?
This is kind of an interesting thing. If a worker bee tries to go to another hive, they may fight her off. They may see her as a robber because a worker can go, they're gatherers. They will go and they might be trying to get honey from another hive. And so that other hive will fight them off and not let them in. There are situations where other workers might be accepted in, but that's a whole other story. But the drones, a drone can go to any hive. Drones, they go and they fly when they're mating with queens. Drones will go to, it's called drone congregation areas. So they fly up and kind of make a little cloud in the sky where all these drones are just flying around. And so when the queens go out to be mated, they'll leave their hive and fly off and find a drone congregation area. How do they find it? I don't know. But they'll fly and find a drone congregation area. They will mate with several drones and then return to their hive. Well, those drones, obviously, if they're up flying around looking for a queen to mate with, they're going to get tired. They need to be fed once in a while. And they can go to any hive. A drone will be accepted into any hive they find and be fed. They don't have to go back to their original hive. So the bees aren't picky about the drones. But, once they're done with the drones, they're done with them. And
so the workers are all female?
Workers are all female, yes.
And what percentage is worker versus drone?
Depending on the time of the year, it varies. In the springtime, you have a lot more drones, and that's part of that swarming process, is that a colony will start to produce a lot of drones, as they're leading up to swarming. But typically, about 10% drones to about 90% workers. And that'll vary. I mean, you could see 80-20 or whatever, but it's a smaller percentage of drones to workers. One exception, this is a weird case, kind of an off topic. If you have a colony that does not have a queen, I should back up on that a second. When the queen lays the eggs, she chooses whether that's going to be a drone or a worker at the time she lays the eggs. And the way that the distinction is made is that a drone egg is not fertilized, but a worker egg is fertilized. So I may get my terminology wrong. I believe that the terms are diploid and haploid, and I believe it's diploid is the unfertilized. So it's only the queen's genetics that go to the drone, whereas for the worker bees, it's the queen and whatever mated drone that she mated with, those genetics combined for the workers. And because a queen mates with multiple drones, you could have workers in the hive that are full sisters, and you can have workers that are half sisters. But if you have a colony that's queenless, the workers can start laying eggs. And so you can end up with a laying worker situation. And those hives get tricky to deal with. But because worker bees don't mate with drones, they can only lay drone unfertilized eggs. So if you have a hive that's queenless, they can produce drones. So, and this comes back to the question about the percentages, because if you have a queenless hive that has a laying worker, you may end up with a hive that's like 80 to 90% drones.
But they won't have any honey.
They might actually make some honey.
Oh, they will.
But eventually that colony is doomed.
Because they can't lay a queen egg.
They can't lay a queen egg, and they can't make any more workers. And they won't accept you can't introduce a new queen because they think they have queens because they have bees that are laying eggs. So it becomes a tricky situation.
So in nature, that swarm would just eventually all die?
Yes, but this is kind of the interesting thing, talking about survival, is that colony left alone is eventually doomed. But before they go out, they're making all these drones, and so kind of spreading their genetics. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a last ditch, we're done, but we're going to leave our mark on the world.
I see.
Yeah.
Wow, this is so fascinating.
It is.
But I am so interested in trying to catch a swarm. We used to have a really nice colony in a hollow walnut tree that it swarmed probably 5 years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, big, strong colonies that Dad got a couple and our neighbor got 3, I think. And there were still bees in there. It was great. And then I think it was the winter of 17 where we had like 21 days where it was under 10 degrees. Killed them.
Oh, gosh.
In that hollow tree. And I don't know, was the hollow tree over the years, did it lose some of its protection, the hole get bigger? But I was so sad to see that go because there was a little flowering tree about 15 feet from that walnut tree. Every time they would leave and hang on that tree, which was about 4 feet off the ground, which was perfect.
Yeah, nice and easy.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very good. Well, you say, when was it that colony died out?
Well, I'm thinking it was 17, but I'm not exactly sure.
And then has moved it back in there since? Huh. That's surprising. I think eventually a swarm would choose to move back in there.
Yeah. But the road crew now cut off all the limbs and changed the tree significantly. So,
and they asked the question earlier about, so if I just put out a box, am I going to get a swarm? And there's no guarantees in life.
Sure.
I've had people coming by my booth saying, I've been putting out swarm traps, I've been doing this, I've been doing that. What am I doing wrong because I'm not catching any? And I've had the same situation. I took 1 year. First year I got bees. I said, okay, I'm going to catch some swarms to get started. I went all around, drove all around the country, put up swarm traps on different friends' properties and so on. Me being, in the suburban area, I thought, well, I need to go out into the country to catch bees. Put up 7 swarm traps. Every 2 weeks I'd go around, check on these swarm traps. I did catch a couple wasps, a couple colonies of wasps, so there's that. But, I didn't catch any honeybees in those swarm traps. I put up I ended up putting out word to my local community saying, hey, if there's any swarms, if you see honeybee swarms, I'd be glad to come collect them. I ended up doing a trap out to get bees from a tree. I had someone who contacted me who was not far from my house. They had bees in their backyard tree. They had dogs that would jump up and snap at the bees, and that was not going well for their dogs. So they asked if I could get the bees out of the tree. I had never done a trap out before, but I had seen YouTube videos, so I knew how to do everything, right? And so I set it up. I did it. It worked perfectly. I caught the queen. There was my first colony. One of the things as a new beekeeper, a lot of mentors will say is don't try to make splits in your first year. That's kind of an advanced thing. Just get your feet grounded. But what did I do? I got these bees from a trap out, and I immediately split them and made 4 more colonies, and it all went well. So
perfect. YouTube worked.
But having said that, I was coming around to the next year. So I had bees from there. The next year, I just put a swarm trap up in my front yard, and caught 2 swarms right there in my front yard, 20 feet from my front door, in the middle of a suburban neighborhood.
So if the environment, that's where I was going, just kind of density of bee colonies.
And what I tell people who say, well, I don't know if I have bees around me to catch. It's like, have you ever seen honeybees like in your yard or your garden or anything? It's like, yeah, I have. Well, then there's bees around. If you've seen honeybees, I'm sure there are some parts of the country, just because there's not enough forage or whatever, that you're not going to see bees. And it may be futile to put up a swarm trap. But if you've seen bees flying around, and kind of going back to my origin story, if you want to say, when I talked about how I got beehives just because I wanted better pollination for my garden. I may not be here today, talking about beekeeping if I had known better, because I thought I needed more honeybees around for pollination. At the time, I did not know there was a colony living in a tree not 50 yards from my backyard fence. But so, they're out there.
Now, this has been a fascinating conversation. Monty, thank you so much for joining us. And for people who want to see your YouTube videos, you're the Suburban Sodbuster on YouTube, and you're on Facebook and Instagram as well.
That's correct.
So if you have any interest, check that out. So, Monty, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.